My bad.
No worries.
All right. So, good afternoon and welcome to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Street Outreach Program Discretionary Grant Review. Next slide, please. All right. So we have a couple of goals for this particular webinar. We have 4 goals. So first of all, we want to orient potential applicants to the fiscal year 24 Notice of Funding Opportunity announcement. Second, we want to provide an overview of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Street Outreach Program, or SOP. Third, we want to address eligibility requirements, application processes, and timelines. And fourth, we want to respond to questions submitted in advance of the webinar. Also, for reference, I'm going to be using some shorthand throughout the presentation. When you hear the word NOFO, that stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity. And then when I say SOP, that stands for our Street Outreach Program. Next slide, please. So in reference to eligibility, we're answering the question, who is able to apply for these funds? Public organizations may apply along with local, tribal, and state government entities. Public organizations may also include school systems. If your organization is a for-profit entity, it is not eligible to apply. University and colleges may apply as long as they are not for profit. An individual person or foreign organization cannot apply for funds. If you are a local or state government organization that is part of the juvenile justice system, your organization is not eligible to apply. Next slide, please. So just some general housekeeping about application submission. The application submission deadline is June 7th, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're applying from a different time zone, please be sure to take this into account. Your application must be submitted to grants.gov unless you've been given an exemption for a paper submission. Your submission is limited to 2 uploaded files. Okay, so the required standard forms, which are detailed on the page 35 of the SOP NOFO, do not count against these 2 files. Next slide, please. There are three key components to the Notice of Funding Opportunity. The first is requirements. This is where you'll provide details about the important program components and requirements, the project narrative, or how you intend to implement it. These are directions for you that explain how the project will meet the purpose of the funding opportunity as described in the program description. There's also a merit review, which is how we will evaluate your application. These are the factors we will use to evaluate your application against requirements in the program description and the project narrative. There are also some important links located in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, including reporting, national program and administrative requirements, and key definitions. Next slide, please. Okay, your application will be screened for eligibility to make sure it meets basic requirements. We will conduct a merit review of all applications deemed eligible using the stated criteria. The criteria corresponds to the program description and the project narrative. Merit review results are not the only factor when making decisions. Award notices will be released late summer of 2024. Next slide, please. So what is the goal of the street outreach program? SOP aims to build relationships between street outreach workers and eligible youth to move them into safe and stable housing or emergency shelter and prepare them for independence. Next slide, please. Now we're going to dive into the project requirements, and we'll provide you details about the important program components and requirements. Next slide, please. So diving into some additional goals. Projects funded through this program provide outreach, education, services, and referrals to help youth living on the street under the age of 22 leave the streets. The program is intended to serve youth who have left home due to family conflict or other crises, and youth who are experiencing homelessness. We also intend to provide street-based services to youth who've been subjected to or are at risk of being subjected to abuse, sexual and labor exploitation, and human trafficking. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a list of the project requirements and all of the different components. Just to read them out loud to you, we're going to go into each of these in a bit more detail. Street outreach and access to shelter, comprehensive youth-centered service model, ensuring equity, outreach implementation strategy, gateway services, screening and assessment, harm reduction, service coordination planning, crisis stabilization, case management, follow-up services, services focused on human trafficking, performance standards, along with training and technical assistance. Next slide, please. Now, diving right in, street outreach and providing access to shelter. That's the first requirement. SOP projects must conduct outreach and engage with youth who have left home due to family conflict or other crises. Also to youth who are experiencing homelessness, youth living on the street, with the goal of helping them stay safe and eventually leave the streets. SOP projects must provide access to emergency shelter or safe and stable housing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, emergency shelter, they must provide emergency shelter and safe and stable housing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Next slide, please. Now, note that the shelters your agency refers to have to meet the following requirements. First, they have to have availability to house youth. They have to have a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, or a letter of commitment from referral partners to ensure that they will accept referrals. Shelters must meet state and local licensing requirements. They must be appropriately supervised, and they must also be age appropriate. They must provide a youth-friendly environment, fostering trust and providing safe spaces for vulnerable populations such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and/or questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit youth. Considering the safety and needs of victims of human trafficking and victims of domestic violence, and they must provide transportation to shelters that is available and easily accessible to youth. Next slide, please. In addition to all of the essential requirements, we also want to provide information about the optional drop-in centers. Again, to reiterate, drop-in centers, providing that is an optional service. A drop-in center does not replace required street-based services or engagement efforts. Drop-in centers should enhance these engagement efforts. They should never replace them. If you do opt to host a drop-in center, the following services need to be accessible to youth and young adults. So you need to be able to provide resource materials about available services, showers, hot meals, laundry, email, phones, and case management. Next slide, please. Now, next, we're talking about the comprehensive youth-centered service model. Programs must ensure that the service model uses a trauma-informed approach and positive youth development framework, which focuses on engaging youth who have lived experience of homelessness to have input on program implementation. Links for resources about trauma-informed care and positive youth development can be found on page 10 of the SOP NOFO. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of ensuring equity, projects must provide safe, inclusive, and culturally responsive spaces and services for all youth, including youth facing disabilities, youth of color, youth who identify as LGBTQIA2S+, and youth from other underserved populations. Also, you must be inclusive of the language access needs of youth and their families. Next slide, please. In terms of the outreach implementation strategy, there are 4 elements that we're going to discuss that are a part of the outreach implementation strategy. The first is a street outreach plan. The second is education and awareness. The third is coordination with the RHY National Communication System. And the fourth is youth engagement and collaboration. Next slide, please. Now, SOP projects must explain this entire litany of things, which is plans for identifying locations where youth and young adults gather, strategies for conducting face-to-face outreach with youth, plans for developing a youth-focused outreach strategy that addresses individual youth needs. You must also identify the number of full-time equivalent outreach workers needed to conduct the program, the frequency and schedule of the outreach visits, techniques for branding your organization, services you will provide to youth, details about carrying basic need packs, your explanation of how street outreach workers will be used to meet goals, street-based safety plans, including a safety plan for staff, protocols and strategies for responding to youth who've experienced or are at risk of experiencing sex or labor trafficking and exploitation. Next, please. The second element of the outreach engagement strategy is education and awareness plan. SOP projects are required to educate the community and youth about street outreach projects. Education and awareness strategies must use youth voices when conducting outreach. Methods may include social media, public service announcements, posting QR codes in public spaces, and partnerships and collaborations with organizations. Additional examples can be found on page 12 of the SOP NOFO. Next slide, please. The final 2 elements of the outreach implementation strategy are coordination with RHY National Communication Systems and youth engagement and collaboration. RHY National Communication Systems require SOP projects to coordinate with the National Communication System for runaway and homeless youth, particularly the National Runaway Safe Line, to provide information on resources. Youth engagement and collaboration requires SOP projects to engage with youth who have lived experience to help locate youth and individualize approaches to meet youth needs. Next slide, please. Next component of the project requirements is gateway services. Gateway services include food, drink, clothing, transportation, and hygiene products to help prevent illness and malnutrition, as well as referrals to emergency shelters. So really honing in on basic needs. Outreach staff will work to build rapport with youth to help identify targeted populations, such as survivors of human trafficking, and provide safety information and resources. Next slide, please. The next element of our project requirement is screening and assessment. SOP projects must establish standardized assessment at the street engagement level, at the intake level, and during program entry into optional drop-in centers. At a minimum, assessments must evaluate strengths, goals, and immediate needs of youth. A full list of the immediate needs to be considered is listed on page 13 of the SOP NOFO. Next slide, please. Now, when creating screening and assessments, they must evaluate the needs of unique subpopulations listed here, such as pregnant and parenting youth, or labor or sexually trafficked or exploited youth. Assessments must prioritize reunifying youth who have left home without permission with an adult who has the youth's best interest in mind and who can help provide stable housing. Next slide, please. Now, regarding harm reduction, programs are required to educate youth about harm reduction, particularly ways to reduce risk of violence, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, sexual assault, unplanned pregnancy, substance use, and other forms of harm associated with street life. Next slide, please. Regarding service coordination plans, SOP projects must create and sustain a service coordination plan by coordinating activities with other organizations serving the same or similar client populations. Examples of organizations include child welfare agencies, juvenile justice schools, and other continuums of care that are specifically defined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Projects. Next slide, please. Within those systems of care and the service coordination plan, some services are required and others are optional. As you can see here, the services listed at the top, such as social service, educational services, organizations that support trafficking survivors, behavioral and mental health, and healthcare providers, are all required. Vocational, educational, referrals to law enforcement, legal services, health insurance plans, and affordable child care are all optional services. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, one thing to remember about the service coordination plan. SOP projects must take steps to return youth who are missing from legal jurisdiction or placement in a juvenile justice or child welfare system. You must help youth who have exited foster care get any benefits that they might be eligible for. Additional information about benefits and accessing those benefits are located on page 15 of the NOFO. Next slide, please. All right, so next we're going to speak a bit about crisis stabilization. SOP projects must be prepared to provide emergency services and link youth to appropriate crisis resources to de-escalate emergencies and assist with urgent care for substance use or mental health conditions, for example. We have a list here of examples, and you can find additional information in the NOFO, but it is not limited to these resources. We encourage any local crisis hotlines or resources that you may have. Next slide, please. All right. Next, SOP projects may need to provide intensive case management to ensure that youth receive assistance with physical, emotional, and behavioral health challenges, access to resources, active engagement with service providers while developing a plan for permanent housing. Next slide, please. Additionally, SOP projects must provide follow-up services to youth who have been engaged through street outreach, including client assessments, case planning, and referral to shelter. Follow-up services refer to the act of assessing youth progress after the youth has received safety and resource referrals. Follow-up contacts are separate from aftercare planning, which is described in federal regulations. Next slide, please. One of the main focuses is providing services to youth who have experienced or are at risk of experiencing human trafficking. So one of the main things we need to do is identify and provide services specifically to those youth and integrate human trafficking prevention and intervention strategies into street outreach plans, screening and assessment tools, staff training development, and also program approaches. Next slide, please. The next piece here is focusing on federal evaluation and technical assistance. Regarding federal evaluation, we will sponsor a federally led evaluation for each funded project. The evaluation will be conducted by an independent contractor with experience leading small and large-scale demonstrations and descriptive and impact evaluations. Regarding technical assistance, if you accept an award, you must agree to work cooperatively with the technical assistance provider. Training in technical assistance is free from the Runaway and Homeless Youth Training, Technical Assistance, and Capacity Building Center, or RITAC. Next slide, please. There are some key components of your application. Your application must include a table of contents at the beginning that guides readers through the contents of your application. It must also contain a project summary, which provides a one-page summary of the project description. Do not cross-reference this document with other parts of the application. In terms of the project narrative, this is where you address all of your proposed activities. This is a critical section of your application, which we will evaluate and rank against other applications using the merit review criteria. Remember that substance and measurable outcomes are more important than length. We are particularly interested in project narratives that convey strategies for achieving intended performance. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move on to the project narrative, where you have the opportunity to explain how you will meet the purpose of the funding opportunity as described in the program description section. Next slide, please. Now, speaking about the program narrative, we have the need for assistance. You're going to identify the problems that you plan to solve. These problems could be physical, economic, social, financial, or institutional, etc. So how do you do that? You're going to demonstrate the need, including the nature and scope of the problem. You may provide supporting documentation, such as letters of support and testimonials in an application and appendix. You can include any relevant data based upon planning studies or needs assessments. You may refer to them in the endnotes or the footnotes of the application. And you can also use demographic data and participant or beneficiary information. Now, in terms of approach, outline your action plan. Describe the scope and detail of how you'll accomplish your proposed project. Account for all functions or activities you identify in your application. Regarding organizational capacity, this is where you're going to discuss your team's capabilities. Provide evidence that your team has the relevant experience and expertise needed to carry out the project. Describe your team's experience with administering, developing, implementing, managing, and evaluating similar projects. Provide evidence that your team has the organizational capability to fulfill their roles and functions effectively. In terms of the project performance evaluation plan, describe a plan for how you will evaluate your project's performance and how it will contribute to continuous quality improvement. With your logic model, you must submit a logic model for designing, managing, and evaluating your project. Regarding the sustainability plan, you have to propose a plan for project sustainability after the period of federal funding ends. We expect you to sustain key elements of your project. Regarding the line item budget and budget narrative, the line item budget and budget justification or narrative must support the information you provide in the Budget Information Standard Form, which is Form SF 424-A. Next slide, please. So when looking at the project narrative and the need for assistance, what problems are you trying to solve? Explain in your application if the problems are social, institutional, financial, etc. Tell us why you need the funding. What's the scope of the problem? Do you have data, needs assessments, or other facts and information that you can present to support your position for the need? Talk to us about who will be receiving the services. Use data, including demographics, to explain who will benefit from these services. Next slide, please. In the approach section, you have the opportunity to describe the scope and detail of how you will accomplish your proposed project and meet all project requirements listed in the program description. You must account for all functions or activities you identify in the application, details about potential obstacles or challenges to accomplishing your project goals, and then explain your strategies for addressing those potential obstacles. Next slide, please. Now, you're going to dive back in and you're going to see some correlation with that program description here, right? So with street outreach and access to shelter, in this section, you have to explain how your program will conduct street outreach, engage with youth who have left home. The description has to include how youth will access emergency services, again, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You have to describe how you will ensure shelter vacancies with your partners. You have to establish and show those MOUs or letters of commitment with shelters to ensure these partners will assist with referrals. Right. Next slide. Regarding the comprehensive youth-centered services model, we're going to be evaluating and taking a look at the description and how you'll include trauma-informed approaches when you're implementing your comprehensive youth-centered service model and PYD, or positive youth development framework, to ensure that youth with lived experience are being engaged and they're being given an opportunity to provide input for implementation of this project. Next slide. Regarding ensuring equity, your approach must detail how your project plans to provide safe, inclusive, culturally responsive spaces and services to all youth, including youth facing disabilities, youth of color, youth who identify as LGBTQIA2S+, and youth from other underserved populations. Again, you must be inclusive of language access needs of youth and their families. Next slide, please. Regarding the outreach implementation plan, you have to explain how your project will implement an outreach strategy to engage youth and educate them on services available through your program. You have to include the 4 components we talked about. Here are the first 2. The street outreach plan, which highlights how you'll seek out youth from the target population and provide information about services available and their benefits. Second is the education and awareness, how you plan to educate and inform the community about your program, including the development and distribution of materials about your project services. Next slide. The third, again, is coordination with the National Runaway Safe Line. How will you coordinate with the National Runaway Safe Line to provide resources to youth at risk of experiencing homelessness? And then 4th is youth engagement and collaboration. How do you plan to work with youth with lived experience to ensure programs include individualized outreach, engagement, and awareness approaches that meet youth needs and are grounded in youth voices? Next slide, please. And the next piece is we're going to focus on gateway services, right? So you have to explain how your project will provide gateway services related to basic needs. The description must include how you will provide youth with food, drink, clothing, transportation, personal safety information, resource guides, and hygiene products, and how you will identify youth who are at risk of trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and other forms of victimization, and provide those youth with resources such as national hotline numbers. Next, please. Okay. In terms of screening and assessments, you have to explain how your project will determine a youth's eligibility for services using screening and assessment tools. You have to include how youth will be assessed and evaluate, and how you will evaluate youth's needs, goals, and strengths during street engagement, intake, or during entry into one of those optional drop-in centers. You have to include how you will assess for foster care and reunification needs. And additionally, the assessment must evaluate the unique needs of specific subpopulations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, wonderful. So in terms of the next two components, one is harm reduction and the other is that service coordination plan. You have to describe for harm reduction how you will establish safety plans and educate youth about harm reduction, and take a look at some of the additional requirements that's provided in the project requirement guidance. Regarding service plan coordination, you must describe your plan for service coordination with other organizations serving the same or similar client populations. What other organizations in your community are doing the same or similar work? At a minimum, the description has to address required systems of care. It has to address any optional systems of care. It has to describe how you will work to return youth who are missing from the legal jurisdiction or placement of juvenile justice or child welfare systems. And you have to describe your plan for assisting youth who have exited foster care. Next slide, please. Okay. In terms of crisis stabilization, your program has to be prepared to provide emergency services and link youth with appropriate crisis resource in the event of an emergency. This can include substance use or even mental health issues. Regarding case management, you must explain how your program will provide case management to services to youth if a youth needs assistance with physical, emotional, and behavioral health challenges. It helps them access resources, active engagement with service providers, and the development of plans for permanent housing. Next slide, please. Okay, so you must explain for follow-up services how your program will provide follow-up services to youth who have been engaged through street outreach, including a client assessment, case planning, or referral to shelter. You must also provide information about follow-up services referring to the act of assessing youth progress after the youth have received safety and resource material referrals, and also describe how you will determine that follow-up contacts are separate from the aftercare planning described in federal regulations. Regarding services focused on human trafficking, you must explain how your program will identify and provide services specifically to youth experiencing or at risk of experiencing human trafficking or exploitation, and how you will integrate human trafficking prevention and intervention strategies into outreach plans, into screening tools and assessments, into staff training and development, and to general program approaches. Next slide, please. Now, for organizational capacity, when you're describing organizational capacity to manage the project, you have to provide evidence that your team has relevant experience and expertise needed to carry out the project. Please describe your team's experience with administering, developing, implementing, managing, and evaluating similar projects. Provide evidence that your team has the organizational capability to fulfill their roles and functions effectively as well. Next slide, please. So some more information about organizational capacity. We expect you to describe your experience working collaboratively with youth and young adults with lived experience of homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness and housing instability to inform program design, implementation, and improvement. If you're not a member of a continuum of care, you must explain your plan to contact and work with a continuum of care in order for HMIS lead for data collection and reporting purposes. You also have to explain which continuum of care you will partner with for the RHY HMIS data collection. If your program provides services in more than one continuum of care, you must explain how you will coordinate data collection and reporting among the multiple continuums of care. Next slide, please. Now, At looking at the plan for oversight of federal funds and activities, you must ensure proper award oversight. The regulation that governs this oversight is federal. This includes standards for the list as you can see them here, but a few examples just to shout them out are financial and program management and procurement, record retention and access. Again, in terms of taking a look and a deeper dive at the oversight of federal awards and funds, please look to the NOFO. Next slide, please. Additionally, when describing oversight of federal fund awards and activities, describe your framework to ensure proper oversight of federal funds, including a description of the governance, policies, and procedures and systems you use for record keeping and financial management, a description of the procedures to identify and mitigate risks and issues, and key staff who will be responsible for maintaining oversight of program activities, staff, and any partners or subrecipients. Next slide, please. Yeah. Regarding current and pending funding support, provide a list of your current and pending funded support of ongoing projects and proposals. Include all resources such as federal, state, and local governments, public or private foundations, for-profit organizations, etc. Be sure to indicate which projects and proposals require committed time from the project director, principal investigator, or other key personnel. Show the total award amount, awarding entity, and the amount of time each key staff member will devote to each project. Next slide, please. One of the key pieces we're looking at here is the project performance evaluation plan. So in describing your project performance evaluation plan, you should include how you will monitor ongoing activities and the progress towards the project's goals and objectives, the inputs, key activities, and expected outcomes of the funded activities, how you will measure the inputs, activities, and outcomes, how you will use the resulting information to inform project improvement of the funded activities, and any processes that support the overall data quality. Next slide, please. Additionally, the organizational systems and processes that may track performance outcomes, please describe those. Also describe how your organization will collect and manage data in a way that allows for accurate and timely reporting of performance outcomes. Describe any potential obstacles to implementing the project performance evaluation and how you will address them, and a timeline of how you will review information from the performance evaluation and apply it to the ongoing project. Now, next slide, please. In terms of the logic model, there are some key components that we're going to talk about within the logic model. In general, a logic model presents how inputs drive activities to produce outputs, outcomes, and the ultimate goal of the proposed project. Explain the links among project elements, and the logic model will also target the identified objectives and goals of the project. The description of your logic model must include details about the program, including inputs, such as traditional resources, organizational profiles, collaborative partners, key staff, or budget, target population, such as the individuals who will be served or identified, activities, mechanisms, and processes, such as evidence-based practices, best practices, approach, key intervention and evaluation components, and continuous quality improvement. Additionally, outputs, which include the immediate and direct results of program activities, outcomes, which include the expected short and long-term results of the project you expect to achieve. These are typically described as changes in people or systems. Project goals, such as overarching objectives and reasons for proposing the project. You must describe how the proposed activities, inputs, and outputs will link to outcomes and be informed by and associated with youth receiving shelter and required services. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to take a look at the project sustainability plan. Please describe the key people and organizations whose support you will require, the types of alternative support you will require to maintain the project, and if the proposed project involves key project partners, how you will maintain their cooperation or collaboration after the federal funding ends. Next slide, please. Now, regarding protection of sensitive or confidential information, describe how you will collect and safeguard protected, personally identifiable information and other information that is considered sensitive. Make sure your approach is consistent with the applicable federal, state, local, and tribal laws regarding privacy and obligations of confidentiality. Also, provide the methods and systems you will use to ensure that you properly handle confidential and sensitive information, including any subrecipients and/or contractors. Describe your plan for the disposition of this information at the end of the performance period. Next slide, please. Regarding the line item budget and the budget narrative. As you're developing your budget, please consider if the costs are necessary, reasonable, allocable, and consistent with your project's purpose and activities. Consider how you calculate your costs in ways that are clear and repeatable, and consider how funds are restricted. See your funding policies and limitations. You must include the cost of sending at least one person to attend the annual in-person RHY National Grantee Training, in-person regional trainings, and up to 2 collaboration events. Next. So next up, we're going to discuss the merit review. Reviewers will review and score your application based upon how thoroughly you answer the questions and the evaluation criteria and sub-criteria. These subsections correspond to the required components of your application as described in the program description and again in the program narrative. Next slide, please. Yes. Oh, no. Well, here we are. So in terms of the need for assistance, explain in your application why it is you need this assistance. In other words, demonstrate the need. What's the extent of street youth and youth homelessness in your community? What resources are already in place to address this issue? Discuss the youth in the community experiencing sexual exploitation, abuse, or human trafficking, and tell us who will be the recipient of these services. Give us demographic data and participant of beneficiary information where you can. Next. When reviewing your application, we'll consider how well you've developed a comprehensive program approach that explains how you plan to, 1, conduct face-to-face outreach, such as engagement activities and strategies for ensuring youth safety and methods for helping youth to leave the streets, how youth will access shelters or safe and stable housing 24 hours a day, and how many full-time outreach workers will perform this work, including MOUs or letters of commitment from shelters, and describe your plan for transporting youth to shelter. Next slide, please. When evaluating outreach, we'll also consider the extent to which you've developed a comprehensive youth-centered service model that explains how well you integrate positive youth development and trauma-informed care into your program. Additionally, we'll evaluate your outreach implementation strategy that includes education, awareness, youth engagement, and your plan for coordinating with the RHY National Communication System. Next slide, please. We'll consider the extent to which you clearly explain your plan for providing gateway services, harm reduction, and crisis stabilization, along with your plan for conducting assessments of needs, coordinating services with other systems of care, and handling case management. Next slide, please. When reviewing your application, we'll consider to the extent to which you've developed a plan for conducting follow-up services that clearly details plans for client assessment, case planning, or referrals to shelters. We will also consider how well you developed a plan for providing human trafficking services that clearly explained how you intend to serve youth experiencing or at risk of experiencing human trafficking or exploitation. Next. In reviewing your performance evaluation plan, we'll consider the extent to which you effectively provided an effective approach for evaluating your program, including RIMUS data, for defining success and improving program performance and what challenges you will face. We will also evaluate your logic model that explains how activities, inputs, and outputs link to outcomes that will prevent youth from experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. In reviewing your organizational capacity, we will consider the extent to which you effectively provided evidence of experience and expertise in operating runaway and homeless youth projects designed to conduct street outreach. We'll also assess your plan to ensure accurate and timely upload of data to RIMUS and how clearly you detailed the scope of work to be performed through third-party working relationships with subrecipients, subcontractors, or other cooperating entities. Next slide, please. In reviewing the budget justification, we'll evaluate how thoroughly you provided a clear line item budget and narrative budget of the federal amount and non-federal amount in your application. We'll also evaluate whether your budget clearly explains why the funds are necessary and confirm you included the costs of sending a staff person to attend the required trainings and meetings. We will also evaluate how much you've indicated it will cost to run your project, and in addition to federal funds from this award, what other funds are required and what the source of those funds will be. Additionally, we'll evaluate how you plan to ensure proper oversight of federal funds and activities. Next slide, please. Now, in reviewing your sustainability plan, we want to know what sources that will support the program if federal funds are not available, and we'll evaluate how well you integrate that. We also want to know your plan for retaining staff and maintaining partnerships if the program loses funding. Next slide. Again, regarding ensuring equity, we're going to evaluate your plan for ensuring equity in service delivery and recruitment, and how the equity plan will impact the organization and community as it is detailed in the program requirement and the project narrative. Next slide. While you're not required to address these in your application, you should receive an award. Should you receive an award under the Notice of Funding Opportunity Announcement, again, the NOFO, you will be required to comply with specific reporting and administrative national policy requirements. Also, you should carefully review the key definitions related to this NOFO available on the FISB website. A link is provided at the bottom of page 52 of the SOP NOFO. Next slide, please. Additional information can be found regarding national program and administrative requirements on page 49 of the NOFO. There are important rules you'll need to follow if you get an award. Many are detailed on page 49. However, a comprehensive list can be found on the Family and Youth Services Bureau website, which cover the following topics: HHS grant policy statements, the equal treatment of faith-based organizations, and RHY program administrative requirements. And as you can see, there's a list here. You are required to adhere to these requirements as a condition of receiving the award. Failure to do so could result in a loss of funding. Next slide, please. If you're successful, you will have to submit financial and performance reports. To learn more about reporting, see reporting on the ACF website. ACF recipients must submit a variety of programmatic and financial reports after receiving a grant award. Accurate and timely submission of required reports is important to each recipient's success and continued funding. You will report performance data through the Runaway and Homeless Youth Homeless Management Information System, again, RIMUS, quarterly. To access RIMUS, you can work with a local Continuum of Care Homeless Management Information System lead. You can find additional information about these requirements in the SOP NOFO. Next slide, please. Note that key NOFO related definitions can be found via a link on the final page of the document under the section titled Reference Websites. Next slide, please. So next, what we're going to do is review some of the submitted questions and some of our responses to these questions. If you have any particular questions or curiosity about those. Next slide, please. So, question 1, do I have to provide outreach? Absolutely. Conducting outreach is a required component of the street outreach program. Details about the required outreach strategy can be found on page 11 of the NOFO. Question 2. Next slide, please. Is the maintenance of effort certification required, and where can it be found? The maintenance of effort certification can be disregarded. The associated requirements are not detailed in the NOFO. Question 3. Confirm if both resumes and job descriptions are required for key personnel. If a staff position is vacant, can we only submit a job description? Conversely, if a staff position is filled, is a resume sufficient, or is a job description also needed? Answer: your application must include resumes or curricula vitae for all key personnel, as well as job descriptions for each key position, both filled and vacant. Question 4. Please clarify what type of information exactly is being requested in the second file. Information on compliance with federal, state, and local government standards? Answer: if there are state, federal, local, or required standards or requirements associated with the program, they should be included in this file. Question 5. The NOFO indicates that grantees need to send one representative to training. Does that have to be one per award or one per agency, regardless of the number of awards? Do organizations need to show this information in the budget? Would that be under non-federal match, assuming that travel isn't federally funded by one of the other awards? Answer: grant recipients are required to send one person to required training for each RHY-funded program. Therefore, if an organization receives 3 different RHY grant awards, then 3 different individuals must attend the required training. Each grant application's budget must reflect the cost of sending a minimum of 1 person to the training. Question 6. Please clarify the allowable level of subawards that can be provided. The link provided on page 18 of the NOFO states that justification must be provided for subawards of greater than 50% of the awards, while guidance on page 33 states that the amount of subawards cannot be more than 50% of the total direct costs. Answer: a subaward to any one organization cannot be more than 50% of the total direct costs. An applicant may exceed subawards of more than 50% of the total direct costs if making subawards to multiple organizations. A justification for subawarding a portion of the project cost must be included along with a detailed budget and budget narrative for each of the subawards. Question 7. If you rely on cost share to match from a third party, then the party must include a firm commitment of these resources in the third party agreement submitted with your application. Would that apply if we were using grant money from another grant that's already secure for this time period? Answer: for any cost sharing, include a detailed listing of any funding sources identified in Block 18 of the SF 424 application for federal assistance. Next question. Under the application contents and format section, project narrative, the instructions state, use the headings and order of the sections that follow. However, headings and order that follow are not numbered and do not consistently match the criteria headings. As we have in prior years, we would like to order our responses to follow the more logical ordering of the criteria. Is this permitted, or must we adhere to the headings and order of the sections as set forth in the application contents and format section? Answer: please review step 3. Prepare your application for information and directions about how to format your application and what information should be included. Next question, please. How are key staff defined? Key positions or personnel are individuals who have a substantial role in the administration and implementation of the funded activities, which includes positions funded in whole or in part by grant funds. And our final question. Can you confirm that we don't have to describe staff training beyond participation in RITAC's conference and regional and other trainings? Answer, please review step 6. Learn what happens after award, administrative and national policy requirements for more detailed information about expectations if you receive an award. The administrative requirements information does not include a detailed list of training that programs must consider offering their staff. Next slide, please. So we want to thank you and let you know that the webinar recording and the PowerPoint will be available on RITAC.net. And thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing your applications. Have a wonderful day.